We're working through these hard sayings of Jesus. And we've got to John chapter 6, looking at a really critical dialogue, really, that Jesus has with those who are around him at the time. And I've got to say, I was looking at John chapter 6 in preparation for this, and I was thinking, man, this chapter, honestly, it is so breathtaking. There is so much packed into it. There's so much to cover that, quite honestly, we stand no chance. All that we're going to be able to do this afternoon is just pick up a few simple ideas, hopefully. But I want to encourage you. This chapter is so central, incredible, breathtaking. I would go as far to say this chapter sums up the Bible. That's how powerful it is. So I want to encourage you, go home and carry on reading it. Just go over the chapter and see how incredible it is. This particular saying that Jesus says at this point in time, the idea of eating his flesh and drinking his blood, it kind of, given that we've had communion, it kind of pulls the rug out of the great reveal of what he was actually saying, doesn't it? Normally, when you're preaching, there's the opportunity to take you through a text and then to kind of almost like unveiling a masterpiece, you pull the cloth away and you say, that's what it's all about. But we're already there. We already know right now what Jesus was talking about when he said, eat my body and drink my blood. So rather than looking at that, I want to just look at some responses, how people responded to what he was saying, and maybe it gives us an opportunity how we today can engage with the hard sayings, not just of Jesus, but the hard sayings of the Bible. Maybe we can come to terms with this dynamic that goes on in the Bible, and particularly in the ministry of Jesus, where he says the most outlandish things. The Bible seems to say the most incredible things. And I think more than anything, this particular text is incredibly relevant for us today. I'm just going to quickly read verse 52 onwards. The Jews began to argue sharply among themselves. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus said to them. Jesus hears them. And he doesn't step back. Jesus, as far as we can see here at this point, he's reaching so many people. He's engaging with so many people. Surely this is the opportunity where he's got the bandwagon rolling. Surely this is the opportunity where if you're really smart, you don't say anything that's going to be offensive. You make sure that you keep people on board. You don't say anything that is going to lose anybody. And Jesus does, in response to the Jews, the complete opposite. He doesn't back down, he ratchets up. Look at verse 53. Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Jesus says, in the most graphic terms, I'm the one to eat. I'm the one to feed on. The outcome of that, the response of people, and we haven't read it, the chapter's big, we're just going to grab a few verses to give us the sense of what happens. On hearing it, we read in verse 60, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept this? This is so hard. Verse 66, from this time many of disciples turned back and no longer followed him. You see, Jesus ratcheted it up. And he culturally got cancelled. Cancel culture is not a new thing. It happened back in the day of Jesus. A really public figure says something which is so culturally unacceptable that we're out of here. We're gone. We reject him. We cancel him. We're no longer on that bandwagon. We're no longer on that agenda. It is outrageous. Herodotus, who's often described as the father of history, probably writing about 450 years before Jesus, he talks about this particular encounter. Darius, who was one of the leaders, pulls in some Greeks and some Galatians, who kind of an Indo people. The Galatians would take, he asked the Galatians, what would it take for them to burn the bodies of their dead fathers as the Greeks do? So at the end of the death, at the point of death, the Greeks celebrated the life of their loved one by cremation. The Galatians were horrified. They said, we'll never do any terrible thing like that. Then he turned to the Greeks and he said, what would it take for you to devour the bodies of your dead ones? To eat the bodies? Just like the Galatians do. And the Greeks gagged with revulsion. Often that's described as a kind of cultural relativism. It's almost, whatever goes on in your culture. I think it's actually a turning point. From that moment on, the idea of cannibalism increasingly was rejected by the ancient world. It was an abomination. And Jesus uses that kind of language about himself. Greek influence has just waved through the ancient world. This idea that cremation and burying or whatever you do, eating the bodies that have died is an outrageous thing that you just don't do. He says something deeply offensive and people reject him. So how are we going to work out what's going on here? How do we come to terms with this particular section? And more importantly, what does it say to us today in terms of how we engage with the sayings of Jesus? The first thing that I would say is it's really important to understand the context in which this saying occurs. What's happened previously in the chapter? Early on in the chapter, we've got this really famous account where Jesus feeds 5,000 people in a miraculous way. They've come to listen to him, they've come to be taught by him, they've come to follow him. And at the end of the chapter, we get this moment where a whole load of those people who followed him reject him because of what he's now said. So there's this really interesting picture that John is portraying. But you see the other connection that John is saying. What he's saying is that these people came and they were fed by Jesus. He fed them. But when he talks about something as outrageous as eating him, which is what he says, they've gone. But it starts with that. It starts with the idea of feeding on him. It's not a big reveal, is it, really? To understand that there was a double dynamic that was going on with the people when they were being fed by Jesus. Why were they there in the first place? Why was it that they had to be fed? Because that's the critical thing in that early part of the story. They had to be fed because they'd been with Jesus without food for so long. Why? Because they were feeding on him in a different way. They were feeding on him. It's not hard to see the picture. They were mentally, spiritually, intellectually feeding on the words of Jesus. And he then physically fed them. There's this incredible, compassionate storyline that is going on in the early part of the chapter, where Jesus is delivering to them the sustenance that they need. and the sustenance that they need for life. Where are you on that journey? Where are you on that journey of coming to terms with your own needs? Understanding who you are, who I am, and what I actually need. You see, it's not just good enough just to be fed physically, is it? I mean, if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all of that kind of stuff, those of you who are into it, we know that it starts there. You can't get to the next stage unless you've actually got some basic human need, but the next stage up is we need something deeper. We need more. That's the kind of people we are. We're human beings which are deeper than just our physical needs. And Jesus was delivering both of those. The next step in the journey is that Jesus not only feeds spiritually, feeds physically, but he then sustains and protects. The disciples go out on the boat to cross to the other side, and they're caught in a storm, and Jesus goes out to them on the water, walking on the water, and he saves them and he protects them. You see, what John, I think, is trying to say when he recounts this incredibly difficult saying, which became a stumbling block for those who heard it, is the backdrop. The context in which Jesus said it is laced with compassion and provision. That's phenomenally important. What's surrounding this difficult saying is compassion and provision. That's what Jesus is like. That's who he is. That's his identity. That's the kind of person that he is as he walks amongst us. And as John has claimed right at the very beginning of his book, by definition, that is what God is like. See, that's what God is like. He's a God of compassion and provision. And therefore, when we stumble on those things that are really difficult, what we should fall back into is the nature of who he is. The kind of person that he is. The kind of being that God is. One of compassion, provision, security, protection. That is what he is like in his relationship with human beings. And therefore, when sayings seem harsh, we lean into the backdrop of his character. How many times we've seen that kind of idea of, I've done it myself years ago, you know, when your kids are about to do something that is really dangerous, and you yell at them, and you seem really harsh, you seem severe. Actually, what you're doing is something which is incredibly compassionate, but it comes out in that moment as seeming hard and harsh. And so the first thing that we see is the contextual significance of who God is and how John portrays this particular saying. The second thing that we see is we see that Jesus leans into the history of the Bible. So there is what I've described as a historical continuity. If we look at verse 43, stop grumbling among yourselves, Jesus said. No one comes to me unless the Father who sent me draws them in, and I will raise them up on the last day. It's written in the prophets. They will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard the Father and learned from him comes to me. No one who has seen the Father except the one who is from God. Only he has seen the Father. Jesus is making this incredible claim. What the prophets said, I am. Way back when they said certain things, they said this. There is going to come a moment. I want you to remove your New Testament sandals, put your Old Testament sandals on, and you're standing in front of a prophet, not Jesus. A prophet who is conveying the words of God, and the prophet at that moment in time is saying, this is what it's going to be like. There is going to come a time when all of you will be taught by God. I know right at the moment you're being taught by a prophet, somebody who stands in between, somebody who represents God. But there's going to come a time when you're taught by God. Jesus is making this outstanding, incredible, and outrageous claim, if it's not true, that he is the very one who fulfills that prophecy. They're going to be taught by God because God is now teaching you. He says, I am the fulfillment of those prophecies. I am the historical continuity of the story of God in the world. When God is dealing with this world, taking this world on a journey, explaining himself, gradually revealing more and more of himself through the prophets, there's going to come a time when he's going to teach them in person, is what Jesus says, or what the prophets say, and I'm that moment. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. You know that provision back there? You know the God-given provision back there? When God's people were released from the slavery of Egypt and they were in the wilderness, God provided for them. But that provision was temporary. They all died. The food that he provided back then is not eternal food. It's temporal food. It's divine. But in terms of what the manna did for God's people in physical terms, it did absolutely nothing more than the takeaway you're about to have on the way home. That's all it did. It just provided physical food. They died. But when the bread of life comes and you feed on that bread, you live eternally. And Jesus says, I am the historical continuity of that. He's kind of saying, as we look at the third point, I am divine sustenance. I'm the food you really need. You think you need certain food, but I'm the food you really need. I think what John is teasing us to consider, because we have the opportunity to read the beginning of the chapter, the feeding of 5,000 people, following the spiritual feeding of Jesus' words, he's teasing us to say, consider this. At the moment where people rejected Jesus because he said something which was culturally outrageous, too hard to understand, or too sickening to consider, that when he said that, they walked away from the spiritual food that they really needed. That's the way the chapter works, I think. I'm the bread of life. I'm the spiritual nurture that gives you food that you won't die after eating. You'll live forever. I am the eternal provision. How can he say that? How can Jesus say that? Well, again, what he does is he winds it up even more. Verse 57, look at what he says. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. The living Father sent me. There's a time when Jesus teaches his disciples to pray. And he says, when you pray, say, Our Father. It trips off our tongues so easily. In the historical context of the day, God's people at that time wouldn't even use the name of God. It was an outrage to even name the name of God. Wouldn't write it down. It was written down in a particular way, so it wasn't offensive because it was too glorious, too holy, too perfect, too beautiful for them to even feel as if they could say it. And Jesus says, what I bring to you is a new relationship where the God who you can't name is now the God who you consider as Father. And I consider the same because I am the eternal Son who has been sent by the eternal Father. So the one who feeds on me will live because of me. It's because of me that you're going to live. How can Jesus say to you and me, who, if we really think about it, if we, as we've said on many occasions, if we wrote out in written form all of the thoughts, motivations, and ideas of our hearts and plastered them over the wall so that everyone in the room could read your most inner thoughts, I'm pretty sure, because I'm just human like you, and I know what I'm like, that if that was the case, I would not be in this room while you read my thoughts and motivations and attitudes and feelings and desires. I know the reality. And yet Jesus says to the people who feed on him, you people who are really like that, if you feed on me, you can live. And that's what we've just celebrated, where we've looked at, in physical terms, a broken body and blood poured out. You see, we celebrate what Jesus said time and time and time again. It's one of those two things that Jesus encouraged, directed, commanded the church to do. He does both, actually. He commands and encourages. Do this. Remembering me. Jude reminded us. Why is that? Why does he say, do this in remembrance of me? Because we forget. I don't think any of us who believe in Jesus, or maybe if you're considering the idea of believing in Jesus, I don't think any of us actually forget that Jesus died on a cross. We don't forget the dynamic of Jesus dying on a cross. We don't even forget the theological idea that he dies so that we don't die, and we take his righteousness and he takes our guilt. I don't think we forget that. I don't think that's what the Bible is talking about when it says, remember this because you keep forgetting. I think it's because we forget the deep implications of it. We forget how outrageously transformational it is. We forget how astounding that grace is. That the reality of our dynamic when written on the wall would be offensive, that we would run out of the door. Never mind the deeper things that we wouldn't even want to write ourselves and look at. And Jesus says, through this, eating my flesh and drinking my blood, by embracing the deep implication of what it means to believe and trust in that salvation story, you will live. That's incredible. That's what we need to keep remembering. I don't think I'll ever forget the theological technicality of how Jesus' death on the cross works for me, but what I do forget is how outrageously gracious it is and how morally unworthy I am in my own being to receive it. And yet he says, receive it because of me. See, that's what we need to remember. That's why the words of Jesus, and we've seen them and we can play it out, and we know we're not surprised by the great reveal. We know what the outcome is. We see what it is. That's the offer of the gospel. That's what Jesus says to you who need to know that we are forgiven and received and accepted. And all of that horrible stuff, as far as God is concerned right now, is cast into the depths of the sea. It's as far as the east is from the west. I love that description. It's not as far as how far the north is from the south, because even though the world of the Bible didn't understand a spherical world, the north finally starts reaching the south again. You can't go far enough away from the south going north where you keep on going. But you can going east and west. As long as you're traveling west, you're always going away from the east, bizarrely. And yet there's something deeper that God is saying in that. You know the book by, his name's gone. But he wrote a book called East of Eden. Thank you. What was he talking about? He's talking about the moment when Cain flees to the east away from God. He goes away from God, and our sin takes us away from God. And God says, I'll cast your sin over there, but you can run back. Isn't that amazing? But you see, there's something else that I just want to conclude with here. You see, let's think about the reaction. Let's place ourselves in that moment. We've been fed the day before by Jesus after this remarkable, breathtaking, incredible teaching. And then he says this outrageous thing that sounds horrendous. Cannibalism, blood, eating his body, all of that kind of thing. And we listen to those words, and as those words land on the hearers, they judge them and decide, on the basis of my judgment of those words, I'm going to reject this Jesus. I'm going to walk away from him. And yet, paradoxically, in another way, in another kind of, from another lens, the very words that they judge and reject are the very words that judge them. Look at verse 53. I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. See, there's a judgment aspect to this. The ones who accept the words are the ones who are raised. There's judgment there, there's a hint, there's a flavor. That God is going to judge how we respond to the words that he says. And they're judging the words that Jesus says and saying, I'm out of here. That's outrageous. He's now become the outsider. But there's another group. There's another response in this chapter. In verse 67, we read this. Jesus turns to the disciples. Many have left him. He says this, you don't want to leave me, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. I think what Peter is saying here, he's not saying, I think Peter and the disciples were just as confused with the words of Jesus. Eating his body, drinking his blood, they were just as bamboozled with those words. But what they decided is, I'm in this moment in time, I'm being asked this question, and my decision is this. I'm going to lean into who I believe Jesus is and trust him, even though I don't know what those words mean. I'm staying not because I understand it, but I believe him. There's the difference. That is faith. That is faith. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 says this. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. You see, here's the disciples. Jesus says this thing. I haven't got a clue what that means, but I'm going to trust it. I'm going to believe it. I think that is a blueprint for every one of us when we decide to trust and believe in Jesus. It might not just be a saying in the Bible that we can't understand or come to terms with. It might be an event in life. It might be something that happens. It might be the way the world unfolds. Do you know what? I don't understand a whole load of pain in this world. I can't really, I can kind of intellectually come to terms with it in theological terms, but I don't understand the depths of it. I can't come to terms with how things are unfolding, but I've got a Jesus who brings the words of life, who says that in some way he has authority over all things, and I don't know how they're working out, but I'm going to trust him. I'm going to believe in him. I'm going to take my stand to say, I believe it. We can do that easily about eating flesh and drinking blood because we can celebrate communion. We know how it unfolded. We know that Jesus died on a cross. We know his body was broken. We know his blood is shed. We know that the Holy Spirit teaches the disciples after the event to explain what those words actually meant. But here's the thing. We don't understand eternity. We might be after the event of eating his flesh and drinking his blood, but we don't understand what eternity means. But we do know that he said, trust in it, because I will give you it if you feed on my words. If you take me as your sustenance. You see, they needed to eat to live. Those who heard Jesus' words, if they didn't eat again and again, day after day after day, they'd have died. In the wilderness, God provided them food, but here's the thing, Jesus says, there's a way to live eternally, and it's to eat on me and to drink, to lap me up. And that's the hope that he brings. That's what he says. We sang a song a few minutes ago, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. That idea of being historically connected, it took me back to 50 years ago where a little old lady was playing a piano and we used to sing it, and it was sung very differently, and some of you might know that. But there's a historical connectedness to what's gone before just in my tiny little life. And there is a historical connectedness. There is this beautiful golden thread that God says to his people in every moment, I'm going to be your sustenance. I'm going to be your hope.